We gonna get to it. Ain't nothing to it but to do it. Ain't nothing to it but to do it. Yo, what's good? Welcome back to another episode of Levitation, the Sunday series, and I got a good one today, and it's called Waiting on the Promise. Let's get into it. One of the key things that I get from the Old Testament is life lessons. Lessons that we can apply to our lives today. We can look at some of these people and we can see where we made some of the same mistakes they did. And sometimes we see some of the same consequences. You got plenty of stories throughout the Old Testament, but there's one I want to talk about today. And that is when God promised Abraham and Sarah that they will bear a child. Now we know that they were of older age, so them bearing a child will be nothing short of a miracle. But this impossible feat was promised to him. Now we must open our Bibles. If we don't open Bibles and look at scripture, I would just be talking. So if this part annoys you for some reason, deal with it. Genesis chapter 16. It says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled into the land of Canaan. Now in the previous chapter, God made the promise to Abram once he reached Canaan. So from the initial promise that God has given Abraham until this occurrence is a span of 10 years. And we can see how most of us start to put our own logic into it to make God's promise come to pass. Sarah came up with this plan. Sarah thought to herself and said, you know what? Maybe God didn't mean it the way that I thought he did. And so she started to rationalize in her own brain and said, you know what? Well, the servant is technically an extension of me. So if Abraham sleeps with my servant, I will still be having a child. It will just be through my servant. Sarah started to question her interpretation skills. Started to question Abraham's interpretation skills. Did God really say what he said? Isn't that what we do? When things take too long, we start to question, did I hear correctly? Am I interpreting right? And when we start to doubt our interpretation, then we start to doubt God and what he said. And now we start to try and help God out. We start to do things in order to make what God promised come to pass. And when we start to add human logic, God has to step back. In verse 4 it says, so Abram had sexual relations with Hagar and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress, Sarai, with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abram, this is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show you who's wrong, you or me. What? And then in verse 6, Abram says, look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit. Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. Now Sarah came up with this plan and it worked, but they didn't get peace from this plan. This is a very important key to know if it's your plan or if it's God's plan. If no peace is there, it's not from God. Now notice I said no peace. I didn't say if no trouble, no obstacles. Don't confuse obstacles and trials with no peace. But if there's peace in the midst of the trials and obstacles, then you know that it's from God. But back to the story, Hagar started to get prideful. She became pregnant. She started feeling herself. She started looking down on Sarah. Because Sarah started feeling a certain type of way, she got the nerve to go to Abraham and blame him for the plan she came up with. So just like what any man would do, look, that's your problem. You handle that. I ain't in it no more. And so Sarah started treating Hagar extra bad to the point where Hagar left security. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to leave out of there. In verse 7, it says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness along the road of Shur. The angel said to her, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from? And where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah, she replied. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can count. And the angel also said, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress. This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives. This same descendant will be a problem to Israel all throughout the Old Testament. That means that we can sometimes cause obstacles that was never meant for us to go through, that God never planned for us to even encounter. But now it exists because of our inability to wait on God. Now Isaac, the promise of God, didn't give birth until 14 years after Ishmael. So that was a total of 24 years they had to wait on God. But then I started to think, what if the promise wasn't supposed to take that long? What if the behavior, the impatience, and the immaturity of Sarah and Abraham caused for their promise to be delayed further? They weren't in a place where the promise could flourish properly. Instead of seeking God, they took matters into their own hands. Y'all, what if us taking matters into our own hands, trying to make things work, is actually delaying the promise that God promised each and every one of us? But there's good news here. And that good news is, in spite of their input, the promise still came to pass. That's one thing to help fuel your faith, is that God will always come through with his promises. Oftentimes when we don't see God's promises quickly, sometimes it's not the right time, but a lot of the times it's because we're not in the place to actually receive that. He may give you a glimpse of the promise, but not actually give you the promise when he told you about it, because you're not ready for it. I don't know about you, but I know personally, if I would have gotten the promise that God has promised me 5 years ago, let's just say I'll be wilding out. So if I know that, don't you think God knows that? What kind of father would he be to give me something that he desperately wants to give me, but knows that I'm not ready for? So even when we don't understand how, we have to trust that God will come through on his promises. When it's taking longer than we expected, we have to trust that God will come through on his promises. And in that time of us waiting for God's promise to come to pass, we must continue to seek after God. Don't seek him just for his promises, but seek him for who he is. And when you seek him for who he is, you're going to gradually grow into the person that's ready for his promises. Keep trusting, keep waiting, keep seeking him, and watch his promises flow. This is Levitation, where we're reaching our highest potential. Stay blessed.